Hello and welcome back to UnHerd on this quite troubling day, to say the least. The news of the shooting of Charlie Kirk is just sinking in still. It's been less than 24 hours. And I wanted to catch up with our very own Sohrab Ahmari in New York and Emily Jashinsky, host of the wonderful Undercurrents channel, who is at the White House today, part of the press pool, and just try to understand the reflections and what we think might happen next. Emily, let's come to you first. What's the mood there amongst the press in the White House? What are you hearing?
It's a really somber mood because, Freddie, today is also September 11th, of course. So Donald Trump went to the Pentagon for a memorial ceremony with the entire cabinet this morning. And as part of the press pool, I'm watching all of these cabinet members come in looking absolutely bereft. Some of them, like Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy and his wife Rachel Campos Duffy, who hosted Fox and Friends with Charlie Kirk not that long ago on a recent weekend. They looked absolutely, absolutely bereft in mourning. That is the tone here at the White House. President Trump briefly addressed reporters as he was leaving the event and said that there's a virtual manhunt underway. He was asked, how do you heal from something like this? And it was very clear that exact question is troubling him at the moment. You can see it on his face.
The news is still fast-paced and is developing every hour. As you say, the suspect or the shooter has not yet been apprehended, so there's a manhunt underway for the shooter. But we're also hearing, kind of in the last hour or so, and a story that was originally just on social media and now appears to be confirmed by the Wall Street Journal, that there were transgender slogans engraved or etched into the bullets, the unused bullets next to the shooter's gun. Have you heard about that? And what are you hearing there?
Yes, and right, Freddie. The Wall Street Journal has now confirmed what were rumors that were floating around the internet at first about these casings. And anyone who thought maybe there was some chance this was a senseless random act of violence, which everyone's gut instinct told them, of course, it was not, those hopes have to be put to rest. This is political violence. This was an assassination. And it's becoming increasingly clear. People are wondering how on earth we are nearly 24 hours into this tragedy with no suspect apprehended. That is incredible. It means that the person who carried out a precise, ostensibly precise, targeted political hit on one of the most popular conservatives in the United States of America is roaming the country, is roaming the world at this moment, and nobody seems to have any idea where to find that person. It's really stunning, and people here are deeply disturbed by that.
And as to the engravings or the reported messages on the casings, I mean, in a way, it's the very last thing you want to hear, isn't it? Because it confirms the worst suspicions, the worst kind of online rumors, and it makes clear that this will only just deepen and sharpen the already very fraught political atmosphere. I mean, it's an additional piece of bad news in a way.
Yeah, and here, if you grew up in the United States in the shadow of 9/11, 9/11, I always associated it at least with back to school. And a back to school mass in Minneapolis was just shot up. Two kids were assassinated in a school shooting at a back to school mass, 2 weeks ago here in the United States. And it appears that there was some transgender influence in that shooting as well. It's all very unclear with these shootings. It's difficult to map someone onto an exact, precise ideology because they tend to be deeply mentally ill and scattered all across the map. But this is twice now in a month where we're seeing something like this happen. So the tension, I mean, you could cut it with a knife.
Sohrab, what is your reflection on that most recent development? It comes so soon after that former shooting that had a transgender shooter. What do you make of it, and what will it do to the political arguments?
Frankly, I think the public reception and political position of the gender movement will shift even more dramatically than it already has. I mean, obviously, on both sides of the Atlantic, there's been rollback of the claims of the movement at the medical level in terms of gender interventions for young people, that sort of thing. But now, if there a component of the trans movement has been radicalized to the extent that they're carrying out what seem to be very professional hits, right? As Emily said, this doesn't look like it's so well done. Well done, of course, as a perverse term for it, but it's so smoothly carried out that you can't imagine this was a guy who had a bizarre dream in which aliens appeared to him, basically your kind of typical lunatic case. It seems a political act, a political assassination coming from, within the heart of the culture war over gender and sexuality. So, these issues will get febrile, and it's already the case that the gender movement is on a back foot when it comes to public polling on many different questions, most notably about male athletes in women's sports. But I can't imagine it becoming even more unpopular in a way, but it could as a result of this. But again, we have to be extremely cautious because of how early it is.
Emily, I see you've been moved on a little bit there, but you're still in the vicinity of the White House. This new detail just adds, doesn't it, to the kind of sense that into this very fraught atmosphere, the worst kind of additional aggravation and trauma has just been added. And it's very hard and sobering and I would say frightening to think how it might now develop. What should we be worried about, do you think? What should we be looking out for in coming days?
Yeah, I think that's totally right, Freddie. And I think it's part of the reason people feel so unsettled and uneasy about what happened. You can see behind me the old executive office building. That's where Vice President J.D. Vance works out of. His team is full of young staff, people who actually grew up, in many cases, coming to the Trump movement through Charlie Kirk. And I think people would be very, very unwise to not spend some time reflecting on the fact that this larger than life personality that many people who are now in their 20s and 30s grew up scrolling through TikTok videos, Twitter videos, Instagram videos, and YouTube, a fixture of Gen Z's social media diet, was just assassinated in front of them. It feels like a seal has been broken in a way, and something really ugly is threatening to come out after this. And I hope and pray that's not the case. It looks like Vice President Vance is heading to Utah, but Kirk is so powerful that he actually convinced Trump with Donald Trump Jr., who was a very close friend of Charlie Kirk's. Donald Trump Jr. referred to him as a little brother in the aftermath of his death. He helped convince Trump to put J.D. Vance on the ticket. That's how powerful this 31-year-old is, the same age as me. That's how powerful he was in the country. It's going to reverberate not only in Washington, but really around the country.
And it's a sign of the times, isn't it, how quickly this became a political argument. Normally, I would say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, even a political assassination like this, political leaders would be at pains in the days and hours afterwards not to kind of lean into the political aspect. People would make very restrained comments about what a tragedy it is for the family and how, free speech and democracy shouldn't function in this way. But it was striking how very quickly the fact that it was put at the door of the left was mentioned in the president's remarks. Obviously, people like Elon Musk have tweeted that in even more fierce language. And now I guess it looks like that is borne out by the evidence on the bullets. Any hope that we had that this could be just a tragedy that wasn't endemically part of the culture war is now behind us. This is just the latest phase of this ever deepening political war.
And it's interesting because Kirk himself had posted on X, I think this was like literally the day before he was shot, that it was important actually to politicize the murder of the Ukrainian refugee in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's what Charlie said, again, like hours before he died. And what's interesting about that is I think there's a sense in the country right now, people believe and see violence as political. Even people like Charlie Kirk, who I think would take no issue with a politicization of what happened to him. Of course, I can't speak for him. Sohrab actually knew him better than I did, but Charlie was saying that violence is now political with a post like that, and it's hard to argue when we see so many examples in the country of people who have there's this toxic confluence of social media sickness, mental illness, and ideology that seems to create this strange brew, and push people increasingly into political violence. So I think it's hard to avoid the reality that it's political in a way that, in the past, it probably was easier to unify.
Sohrab, what do you say to that? I mean, there are almost no voices today trying to deny that it was part of the political argument, are there? It feels very different to tragedies that have happened in previous years. It's like it's concurrent with the fierce debate, and almost no one is trying to take the politics out of it and have a pause, and try to cool temperatures. If anything, they're just getting hotter and hotter.
That's right, Freddie. I think partly it has to do, at least for me, I found the images, which are blessedly now off of my social media feed. I don't know if that was a conscious decision by the likes of X to take him down, but early on they just kept looping, and the more you scrolled, some other person had it in like slow motion. I think for many people on the right, it's because this was a guy who made "I will debate you, let's talk it out" his motto, his métier. And he's doing it right there. It takes place in the moment where he is kind of carrying out this classically liberal ideal of we can somehow try to persuade each other, or at least understand where the disagreements lie better if we try to talk. And he gives an answer. I believe the answer was about guns and violence as one of these ironies, these dark ironies of history. And he finishes giving his answer, and then he's shot. And I think the image...
I mean, sorry to interrupt, but it may not be an irony. There is another possibility, which is the shooter was actually listening to the speech and was timing it. I mean, obviously we have no idea, but these are the kind of thoughts that everyone must be having.
Right, that's possible. So I don't know, and I'm sure in the coming days and weeks we'll get ever more granular kind of information about all of that. But the impression is, in a way, or the message that is trying to be communicated by the killer, is that ultimately a bullet wheezing through the sky at several thousand feet per second can beat any argument, that a gun can ultimately silence any debate or settle any debate. And that's a very dark thought. It's a very discomforting thought. And, especially for a lot of young people who've grown up in the age of Charlie Kirk, of the kind of debate bros and the podcast bros, whatever you might think of the quality of those debates and the depth of the arguments, whatever you might think of that, I think I'm kind of circling back to what Emily said, but like they watched, they learned, they took their own political consciousness from these interactions, and then suddenly the conversation stops, and the conversation stops by a resounding sound of a bullet.
His debate series was literally titled "Prove Me Wrong," and instead of proving him wrong, which is, as you say, an invitation to debate him, someone took a different view, which is, I don't want to prove you wrong. I'm going to silence you completely and permanently. Emily, are you hearing that concern alongside the political argument? I mean, are you hearing people who are saying, let's make sure that we retain the idea of civilized debate. Let's make sure that disagreeing without resorting to violence stays alive and flourishes as a concept? Or are people just leaning straight into, that this was a manifestation of the left and therefore we must increase our attempts to defeat them as the right?
Yeah, I think the question for the right at this moment, based on what I've heard, is whether both is possible, whether you're actually able to, and this gets to Sohrab's allusion to classical liberalism, whether you're actually able to continue the Kirk legacy of prove me wrong, debating in open air formats on college campuses, every topic under the sun with vigor and civility, or if it's no longer possible, if the center doesn't hold and people feel increasingly desperate and either nihilistic Maybe that nihilism manifests itself in total ambivalence, unplugging, disconnecting, disengaging from politics. Maybe it manifests itself in more violence, God forbid. But that's really what the risk is. Is there a middle road for the right that believes the left is responsible for radicalizing political assassins, but also believes in the legacy of Charlie Kirk and civic debate? That's I think, a critical question for the country. We've seen Ezra Klein, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Dean Withers, all of these people on the left reacting with horror to what's happened, and far from, celebrating the assassination of Charlie Kirk, which I think everyone understands is a good sign. But they are the elite. They are not the kind of rank and file left, and people on the right who are reacting. David French, the New York Times, they're not the rank and file right. And so what happens? I mean, basically everybody in elite spaces is agreed. There's an elite consensus against political violence. But does that trickle down to everybody else now when people feel so desperate? I don't know.
And you see that on social media, very high-minded comments by public officials, and then you look to the comments underneath the comments, and they're much darker. Sohrab, David French was just mentioned by Emily. One of your most famous arguments historically was with David French, who was maintaining that this kind of classical liberalism could survive. You took the view that it couldn't. Do you think you're being proven right in a grim way over the succeeding years, that that sense of civil debate is no longer perceived as a way to win your political objectives?
In a way, post-liberalism, which is the kind of the movement that was set off by that David French Sohrab Ahmari debate, is more descriptive. It's a description of the world we live in. It isn't necessarily a prescriptive one per se, but it's that somehow liberalism itself, you might disagree, Freddie, and I don't know if we can hash this out in this context, because of its autonomy maximizing, me individualism, tears at the moral foundations that are necessary for that kind of good civic, debate to sustain itself, right? Whether it's through tech companies that turn people's brains into toxic mush, or just this kind of everyone's sense of I am aggrieved, I'm the rights-bearing individual, and I'm at war with my fellow human beings, which is kind of the premise, the Hobbesian premise of all classical liberalism. For whatever reason, we get to the point where liberal practices, which I celebrate, obviously I celebrate, cannot sustain themselves because there has been this deeper moral erosion.
That's a preview, perhaps, of the bigger philosophical question. Emily, taking us right back, sort of down to earth in a sense, what do you think happens as in terms of a reaction to this? I mean, that's what a lot of people will be wondering and worrying about. Do you think we will see steps by the administration to clamp down, to increase security, to maybe take matters more into a kind of centralized, controlled state kind of situation? What would you expect in terms of the administration's reaction?
I think we absolutely can expect a policy response. Where that lands on the spectrum is still unclear. Chris Rufo, obviously somebody who is close to this administration and has a lot of influence in this administration, posted after Kirk's assassination that the administration should perhaps look to the example of J. Edgar Hoover, who, as FBI director, basically did everything he could to crush the American left, some of which at the time was legitimately engaging in political violence and plotting political violence, not all of which was, though. And so is it going to actually look like something J. Edgar Hoover-style? Trump's message from the Oval Office last night felt to me, as somebody who's covered him for a long time, very angry and very dark. And obviously this morning was somber. Trump was standing about 5 feet away from me outside of the Pentagon when he was answering questions about what comes next. And he looked very unusually downbeat and tired and angry too. So he was speaking very softly, which was interesting. I don't know exactly what they're going to do, but I would expect when you have Kash Patel, somebody who's as hardcore of an anti-leftist you could possibly find in the White House, or I'm sorry, in the FBI, it's going to come fast and furious. But whether it's a full J. Edgar Hoover-style crackdown or not is yet to be determined. Because, by the way, I should just very quickly add, a lot of people on the right have been studying over the last 10 years as they felt the FBI was being abused and turned towards parents at school board meetings. They've studied the Hoover years and said there were great excesses. So where does the right land in this moment is actually a very salient question.
What would that look like, though, just so to explain it to our viewers? What would a J. Edgar Hoover-style crackdown from an angry President Trump look like, do you think? I mean, what does that actually mean?
Hoover and his FBI sort of famously sought to infiltrate communist groups, and some of which actually were violent, but also some nonviolent groups, in ways that ended up radicalizing them because there were FBI informants embedded in those various groups who were trying to track them ostensibly in the effort, or purportedly in the effort, to stop political violence. But sometimes that ended up ratcheting up political violence because informants would use inflammatory rhetoric to bait others into using inflammatory rhetoric and then have a pretext to crack down on them. So one thing I would expect to maybe see, given the new conservative focus on the sort of nexus of funding that goes to progressive left-wing groups in this country, is potentially something from the IRS, potentially from the Treasury, looking at the funding of groups on the left in ways that some on the right may be uncomfortable with, but basically just cracking down and turning the microscope onto left-wing nonprofits that they feel they can connect with, ratcheting up tensions and, in some way connect them to political violence.
Do you think there will be focus on all kinds of inflammatory rhetoric, or do you think what we're likely to see is a specific, targeted, almost like a counterattack by the administration on what they perceive to be left-wing enemies?
Yeah, I mean, you just used the word counterattack. Hoover's FBI, obviously, famously, what emerged was, doing co-intel, so counterintelligence on these left-wing groups, and that's where a lot of the history we just talked about comes from. I don't think that it will affect groups on the right. That did happen some during Hoover's reign, but I think right now the anger is so visceral and so raw because people knew Charlie Kirk so personally in the first family, throughout the administration, in the FBI. I would expect this to be laser targeted because there's really no border for dissent right now from the idea that this was something that springs from a particular ideology. Now, I'm a civil libertarian. I don't particularly want anyone to be over surveilled or cracked down on, least of all in a way that's overtly partisan. But Sohrab mentions the sort of crack up of classical liberalism, the loss of faith and trust in classical liberalism on the right. People feel at a loss. Well, what are we supposed to do when Donald Trump is getting gunned down at a rally and Charlie Kirk is getting gunned down on a college campus? And it's genuinely hard to come up with answers to that question, and that's sort of the problem right now.
So, what would you like to see? I mean, we've heard a kind of dark prospect from Emily just now of what we might see in coming weeks. What would you like to see a kind of the best version of this administration do now?
Well, look, I mean, I think there is the law enforcement element, and the degree of sophistication and organization of this operation suggests potentially that the assailant, the perpetrator, had kind of network support. I don't know that, but it could be. And if there is, then there is this task of dismantling these groups. There is a kind of confluence of Antifa and like really radical transgender ideology that emerged around 2020, like the kind of consistent attacks on federal courthouses, which unfortunately they were winked at a lot of times instead of being confronted. So like dismantling those networks in the same way that we would dismantle Islamist networks, jihadi networks, that's part of it. But I think there's this kind of larger set of issues that I would love to see the administration tackle. In some ways, that's the whole project of Trumpism, but it's the loneliness of your typical American, especially young American, compounded by social media, compounded by drug use, whether it's licit drugs over prescription or whether it's marijuana, which we increasingly see has a kind of destructive, psychopathizing effect. All of that kind of bundle of the alienated young man who goes boom one way or another doesn't all, that's the worst expression of it or the worst symptom of it. But it also plays out in other ways, just self-destructive behavior, people who can't form families, don't form families, who, even if we get an economy in which there's more jobs available, they're not capable of doing it. It's that kind of deeper social healing, which will not come from just cracking down. Even though I accept that there has to be, if there is a concerted, again, terror network or whatever, that should be confronted and dismantled. But not everything can be we can't law enforcement and crack down our way out of the deeper pathologies that this kind of killer embodied.
And Freddie, if I may add to that just really quickly, Charlie Kirk over the course of his career went from talking and focusing extensively on big government, lower taxes, a smaller administrative state, to talking extensively about what Sohrab just described, which is a discussion of these deeper core foundational questions about masculinity, femininity, men, women, marriage, children, all of those things. And that was the arc of his career. And it's been the arc of America, sort of obsessing over the normal political battles du jour, but to now focusing more and more on this deeper civilizational crisis. Another quick point, this administration has developed tools to do social media surveillance of people who are applying to come to the United States on ideological questions. We've seen that. And people who are already in the United States, potentially on visas, we've seen that. Would not surprise me if we start seeing crackdowns on people who sort of are posting pretty, let's say, spicy, dangerous things on social media in the days to come.
Yeah, I have to say, I saw this phenomenon because I'm on Blue Sky, which is the more kind of progressive alternative to X. And I saw people on Twitter posting these kind of collages of posts on Blue Sky in which people are asking who should be next. We should hit Elon next. We should hit Vance next, this kind of stuff. And I thought, okay, well, I'm on Blue Sky. And I just typed in next and hit next. And my feed filled up with people openly saying, now, okay, I'm not saying it's anyone prominent. And again, like the right has its own rhetorical excesses, which people who know my work know that I've taken on for a number of years now, as the kind of right has become, a certain kind of unlined right has become more extreme. However, I've never seen anything comparable even on the worst of the online right, where people are like, which prominent conservative personality should be assassinated next, by name. Again, not prominent accounts, and we have to be wary of bots or maybe even foreign states who try to kind of foment this kind of division in our society in a moment of crisis. All possible, but still, I mean, the volume of it makes you think, like, what the hell is going on with the other half of the political spectrum?
Well, and on both sides, the free speech kind of activists are going to have a tough time in the coming weeks and months, because faced with the choice of defending free speech for your political opponents or cracking down in the face of these kinds of violent outrages, I think Emily must be right that the administration will choose the second option.
Well, I do hope, though. I mean, I think there's one thing there's violent rhetoric, which is never, imminent threats to persons, that kind of thing has never been protected by the First Amendment. But then there is robust discussion of the kind that Charlie Kirk carried out. And I really do hope, and by the way, it's a kind of ancient Western civilizational value. And I just hope that we hang on to in the spirit of honoring Charlie Kirk, rather than giving it up, or trampling it more than it has been in recent years.
That's a very good note on which to end. Sohrab Ahmari and Emily Jashinsky, thank you both so much.
Thanks, Freddie.
Thanks.
That was Sohrab Ahmari, the US editor of UnHerd, and Emily Jashinsky, host of our excellent Undercurrents channel. If you haven't, do please check it out. Thanks to both of them, and thanks to you. Next, in trying to make sense of this very rapidly evolving and very concerning story, we are going to be talking to Thomas Chatterton Williams in the coming days. He has just published a book about the crazy summer of 2020, when all of these ideologies hardened and suddenly threatened to undermine what we thought of as a kind of free and democratic civilization. Unfortunately, his warnings seem all too prescient today. So looking forward to that. In the meantime, thanks for joining. This was UnHerd.